Okay, so you will have hopefully seen the program. It's in this beautiful little booklet here. So there's no need for me to rehearse what we're about to do, but we're effectively going to move through time. Time is never a straight line. It's a series of recursions, a series of loops, jump cuts. But first we're going to start with someone whose life has paralleled the history of the context and the environment around them, which of course in this case is the UAE, in particular Abu Dhabi. His Excellency Zaki Nusseibeh is one such person. He was recently made Minister of State in the UAE and is charged with public and cultural diplomacy. I'm going to keep the biography very, very short because in effect the conversation over the next 45 minutes or so is going to be a sort of conversational excursion into his life and the relationship between his life and the burgeoning cultural environment that has happened around him. So this conversation, of course, and Zaki Nusseibeh is known already to many of you. He's had a very special relationship with Sheikh Zayed, who is the founder of the UAE, and who is being remembered this year, in particular, the year of Zayed, as it marks 100 years since his birth. So this conversation will explore the origins and evolution between the Arab 20th and 21st centuries. And it's hosted by another person whose life contains multitudes of time and place, HANS Obrist. He's the director of the Serpentine Gallery and a very, very long-term family member of the Global Art Forum. Will you please join me in welcoming His Excellency Zaki Nusseibeh and HANS Obrist. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Shumon, and it's indeed a great pleasure and privilege to be here tonight and ask Zaki questions about his extraordinary life and extraordinary projects. Before that, I wanted to thank, of course, the Global Art Forum. For me, the experience over the last years to regularly participate has been amazingly important for the research. It's actually for more than 10 years now that I regularly, visit the UAE, Art Dubai, and of course the different, cities, and always very helpful for the research. A direct outcome, for example, of my visits there was that on the occasion of my very first time in Dubai, I saw a leporello of a then little-known artist called Etel Adnan, and felt it incredibly urgent to meet this artist, find out that she lived in Paris. The day coming back, immediately visited her. I've worked with her ever since on many projects, and of course we did an exhibition of her at the Serpentine. So it's been an amazing experience, and is an amazing experience in terms of not only discovering new artists, but also rediscovering positions of pioneering artists of previous generations. And memory is important in the digital age, because we live in an age where we have more and more information, but that doesn't necessarily mean, I think, that we have more memory. As Rem Koolhaas once said, it might actually be that amnesia is somewhere there at the very core of the digital age, which is why I believe often that we need to follow what Eric Hobsbawm always advised me to do. We need to protest against forgetting and bring memories back. And of course, no one else has more amazing memories in terms of your pioneering work, Zaki, than you. And I wanted to begin with the very beginning and ask you a little bit to tell us about your very beginnings, how you grew up and how you came actually to culture. Because of course, today you always say how important it is for society to have culture and education, but I wanted to know how this all began.
Thank you very much, Hans. Thank you very much, Shumon. All of you for being here with us today. The beginning of a journey is always an exciting narrative because it happened. I was born in Jerusalem. I grew up as a young boy in Jerusalem. And of course, the environment in Jerusalem was multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-community. I come from a Muslim family that had the honor of holding the keys to the Holy Sepulchre for more than 1,500 years. And I was educated in England. So I had the opportunity to come here. I went to school, I went to university. And then suddenly the '67 war broke out in the Middle East. So that was the first tragedy that the whole Middle East suffered together. And at the same time, in the Gulf, there was a new narrative developing. There was the Emirates themselves, 7 disparate, different Emirates at the time, going through economic hardships at that time as well. Oil was just being discovered, it was just being exported. And for a number of reasons, in the first half of the 20th century, the Emirates have been through very harsh times. The world depression, the development of the cultured pearls in Japan meant that the economics and society in the Emirates was very fragile. And on top of all of this, the British government, which had a special treaty relationship with the different Emirates that lasted 150 years, decided to withdraw their security umbrella from the region. And in that environment, a man rose in the Emirates called Sheikh Zayed. In 1966, he became the ruler of Abu Dhabi, the Emirate of Abu Dhabi itself. He had already proven his amazing, charismatic qualities as leader. Even without the benefit of oil resources, he had already proven his qualities in his early careers as a young man. And this man came in 1966 and took the reins of power in the Emirates and had to face the 2 challenges of that area, of that region, which were existential. Building an infrastructure and at the same time facing the security void that was left by the Britain leaving that region. And it was in that moment that I had the greatest opportunity, luck, fortune in my life to come out to Abu Dhabi and to meet with Sheikh Zayed. And as a young man then, I mean very young, I came to Abu Dhabi in 67. I worked a bit in the media. I met everybody. Abu Dhabi was a small village then. One hotel where everybody went in the evening. And you met all the decision makers. And because I was a stringer for Financial Times and Reuters and others, I met all of those decision makers. I met Sheikh Zayed. And then I had this blessing, I believe, of being asked to become his interpreter and press media director and then advisor. And I saw him work these 2 miracles, building an infrastructure, an economic infrastructure, and making sure that the Emirates would emerge on the world scene as a federation, a successful one. Now, for myself, education and culture were always part of my upbringing, but I saw that for Sheikh Zayed, those 2 pillars were the most important 2 pillars in his strategy for developing the Emirates. Investment in education to bring up the young generations of Emiratis that we see around us today, starting from scratch, and investment in culture, because he truly believed that it is important not only to bring schools and universities to an area that lacked them at that time in history, but also to invest in cultural development, to bring his young people, to give them the training, the ability to face the existential challenges that face them. And I was very fortunate in being able to work with him during his reign, and to continue to see this legacy being upheld by his successors.
Now, writing also entered your life quite early on, and you actually began to work as a journalist, as a reporter, and you wrote on many different things. You wrote economic stories, you wrote on the construction of the airport, you also started to write political stories. Can you tell us a little bit about your life as a journalist?
Well, it was exciting because, of course, until then, that area, that period, that part of the world was not really very well known internationally. And suddenly, with the coming to power of Sheikh Zayed in 1966, but also with the British decision to withdraw its security umbrella from the region, the world press became interested and involved in the region. And so the foreign editors started coming to visit Abu Dhabi on the go. As I said, there was only one hotel. Dubai had more hotels, of course, and had more commercial activities, but still, the whole infrastructure was very fragile. And so these top editors would come to look at these two issues. They wanted to see what were the plans for Sheikh Zayed and for the other emirates to work for developing infrastructures, important infrastructures. Oil had started being exported, and they wanted to know what was happening. Those were the economic stories. They wanted to know that a major airport is being built, or a major harbor, or a major infrastructure of roads. But at the same time, they wanted to know what will the future of that region be politically. Because once the British announced their decision to withdraw their protection from that region and announced it abruptly without giving the rulers the time or chance to develop an alternative security structure to look after the sovereignty and independence of those emirates, the world wanted to know what was going to happen to this region. And I must say, most of the observers who came then, political, diplomatic, did not actually believe that the Emirates will be capable to survive this storm, this security turmoil that is going to be created around them. So they were passing through that region, and they did not want to appoint full-time journalists or reporters in those countries, but they welcomed having somebody who spoke Arabic, spoke languages, and who was able. I studied economics at Cambridge, and they thought that I could be useful in being a media person. And as a stringer, you wrote a story, and then if they published it, they paid you £5 at the time. I tried to write the same story in 10 different times, but made a living out of it. But that was how I met Sheikh Zayed, translated for him, and because he knew who my family was and who eventually started working for him. Immediately, not eventually. I mean, my first interview was with him in the Husan, the traditional fort where the ruling family of the Al Nahyan had lived for 300 years. And immediately I became his official interpreter. So I came with him to England and found myself at 21, I think, translating between him and Her Majesty the Queen. You can imagine.
And it's interesting because yesterday, we had a conversation with Noah Rafford, who is going to speak here later today, who is the Chief Operating Officer and Futurist-in-Chief of the Dubai Future Foundation, and with Shuman, and we talked about this idea of what's happening when actually, reality is mirrored. We call it the extreme present, in a book we wrote with Shuman and Douglas Copeland. And I always had conversations about that with Eric Hobsbawm, because when he wrote the book of The Age of the Extreme about the 20th century, he talked about this idea of mirroring the development of new nations. And it's an extraordinary thing that you've, of course, been doing that, not only through your journalism, but through your translation and through all your work. You've been mirroring the sort of, birth of the very beginnings of a nation. Can you tell us a little bit about how that is? And
it was the most exciting and the most amazing experience that anyone can go through, because Shemont was just saying that the Emirates moved from the pre-industrial to the post-industrial era. In fact, I call it even more than that. It moved from the, if you like, pre-Renaissance into the post-industrial era over the last 50 years. I do not believe that any other region of the world was able to go through such major transformations without at the same time suffering any of the wrenching experiences that sometimes go with rapid changes. And again, I go back to the wisdom of this man, this leader who came at an appointment with destiny to lead his nation from this pre-industrial, pre-Renaissance era. And I will come to a story about this, into the post-industrial one, because in the very first meeting I had with him, which was in his traditional palace or fort in Abu Dhabi, he gave me his strategy. He said that he wanted to do 3 things at the same time. He wanted to ensure that he brings prosperity for his own people that have suffered for so long. But he said at the same time, this help should not only extend to my own people, to the sons of the Gulf, but I should extend a hand of assistance to all those who need it worldwide. So he had this wide vision, humanist vision from the beginning, that he was there to help not only his own people, but other countries, mankind. And then he said, this federation, I must bring about a federation. This is at a time when all the diplomats I met and all the journalists I used to take to see him would say that there is no way for the 7 different emirates, 9 in the beginning, to come together and agree amongst themselves and create a modern political structure. And yet he said, I must create this federation. And he said, I must at the same time establish a network of friendship and partnerships with the rest of the world, the Arab, the Muslim, the rest of the world, because a true conviction of his was that all of us are one family, born of Adam and Eve. I mean, he used to say, we are just one family, despite the ethnic or racial or religious background of any of us, we belong to the same family. But then the third thing he said, which was amazingly also far-reaching and far-sighted, he said, we must bring the modern world to our country, and we must open bridges to the rest of the world. We must exchange with the rest of the world, but at the same time, we must retain our national soul, we must retain our heritage and our traditions. And so he brought his people from this pre-industrial, and I will tell you a story about this. We were in Malaga in 1969, watching the first man landing on the moon. And Sheikh Zayed told me, Zaki, translate this. It was in Spanish, and I didn't know Spanish at the time. So I told him, this is Spanish, Your Highness. And he said, don't mind, just go ahead, try. I know you can try. So I said, okay, I will try. I started translating. All of the men around him, and you must remember, these were old men. They were brought up in a region that was isolated. I mean, in the 19th century, of course, the Emirates had reached a level of wealth and development and advancement, international trade, but the first half of the 20th century was really tough on all of them. No schooling, no formal education, no health facilities. All of these men were saying, this is nonsense, Nobody can go through the 7 heavens and land on a moon. This must be a Hollywood setup. And Sheikh Zayed turned to them and said, but the Quran says that man is created by God the Almighty, and that he has given him the ability to do anything that he wills him to do. And all of the men around him said, yes, Your Highness, you are right. And this is how he brought them along with him. I mean, to believe in the possibilities for the future. Of course, now the UAE is planning to be or to be the first nation, perhaps, to create a city on Mars. And I can imagine those old colleagues of Sheikh Zayed come and sit and discuss with us today about is it possible to go to Mars? To be able to have witnessed this I think was really a unique opportunity, and to see Sheikh Zayed work at creating this new state, at investing so heavily in education, in culture, and then to see the succession when he passed away, to see this continue, but on a new level. So if we have moved from a pre-Renaissance to an industrial era in the first 50 years, we are moving now, the next 50 years, I see it, into new global horizons, with the government of the UAE keen to be the first internationally in a number, in renewable energy, in artificial intelligence, in cyberspace, in creating a future that is, again, with the same humanist face that Sheikh Zayed started with. The Emirates continue today to be the largest, greatest donor of aid worldwide in terms of its per capita income. So what an amazing experience. I've seen in 50 years the transformation of galaxies, I'd say, of universes, and it's all before us. And we have now the young generation of Emiratis sitting with us, Rhodes scholars from Oxford, ministers of culture, young ministers, young ambassadors. It is amazing to see that this has happened in our lifetime. And it is amazing to see the promise that they bring not only to the people of the UAE, but to the region around us. And we've discussed this. We really need in our region to have hope come to replace the despair and the sorrow and the violence and the brutality that reigns everywhere around us.
And you said hope, and of course Gerhard Richter, the artist, always says art is the highest form of hope. And it's interesting that, you know, you told us in a wonderful way about you being a witness of so many amazing things. But then, of course, you're also somebody who produces reality and who makes culture and education very central in your projects. And it's interesting, I found an interview in Bidun where you were asked by the interviewer that, and that's the question, it seems that there has been an increased focus on culture and education in the years since Sheikh Zayed died. And you said, yes, culture and education, they are linked, museums and education. And then talk about the importance and the urgency of that. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit more about that, why you feel that museums and education are
because
so
I believe art is what makes us share our humanity. Art and culture is what brings us together. It's what makes us aware of being part of the same universe, not belonging to isolated islands, each living on his or her own, hostile to everything around us. And art and culture are important ingredients of a full education for any young person. I'm a strong believer in this. Sheikh Zayed was a strong believer in that. And of course, his successor, Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, they all focus on the need to invest in culture and art, because they say culture and art is what, with education, is what makes us aware of our humanity. It makes us appreciate what is beautiful in the world around us. It makes us understand that we need to live with each other and we need to reach out to others. The museums, for instance, with Sheikh Zayed, was always an important step in his strategy. He always talked to us. I remember one of the first interviews I had for him with a British author, Claude Morris, in the early 70s, who wrote a book called The Desert Falcon. Sheikh Zayed told us how in the 50s, before oil, he traveled. He went to England, he went to France, he went to America. He said in France, for instance, he went to see the museums and the universities and said, one day we should have this in our own country. Now, this was in the 50s, when dreaming of this would have seemed to have been a vision, but not a realistic one. And yet today we have the Louvre Abu Dhabi, we have the Sorbonne Abu Dhabi, we have the New York University, the American University in Sharjah, hundreds of universities sprung out. Why? Because the leadership has focused on the need to invest in our youth, in our young people, to bring them education, but a fulsome education, not just a classroom where you go in order to study a course and then bring it out for an exam and then forget all about it. They want a museum where you can go and learn, where it can incite you to look at different cultures, at different peoples. And this started, as I said, back in 1969 when Sheikh Zayed asked us to build our first museum, which was an archaeological museum in Al Ain, before the infrastructure was put in place, before electricity came to Abu Dhabi and Al Ain, because he wanted people to learn about the history of the region, about the communities that lived there 5,000, 6,000 years ago, that traded with the Indus Valley, with Mesopotamia. And this is why we're so happy to be working now towards the building of the National Sheikh Zayed Museum, which will tell that story, and to have worked so closely with the British Museum, with MacGregor in particular, in bringing exhibitions out to Abu Dhabi to tell the story of Mesopotamia, to tell the world how the region, the whole region in the Gulf, was also an important contributor to world civilization. When we talk about clash of civilizations, we really are talking about clash of cultures. Cultures that believe each culture to be separate, to be unique, to be independent. And yet when you come in a museum like the Louvre Abu Dhabi and you look at the narrative, at the museal narrative within that, within the Louvre, that tells you in the same periods of time, different cultures worked at the same things more or less, had the same considerations, the same preoccupation. It teaches us for the need to learn about each other, to open our hearts to each other, and to understand that we belong, as Sheikh Zayed always said, to the same family. This is why culture and art are so important to us, to our leaders, and this is why, again, I have been very fortunate to be able to work with them in the realization of this vast project that is the cultural strategies of the United Arab Emirates.
And of course, the Encounters of Artists, one of the very first one, were Christo and Jean-Claude, and we have at the Serpentine Galleries at the moment the mastaba of Christo and Jean-Claude floating on the lake, and it started actually 2 years ago when Jana Peel and I and our teams invited Christo to come and do a lecture in one of our marathons, which are these knowledge festivals we're doing, because we believe we need to bring all the disciplines together, and the theme was the theme of miracles. It was co-curated also with Ben Vickers, our Chief Technology Officer, who is here. And we invited Christo, of course, to talk about the miracle of walking on water, which is the amazing project he did in Italy. And then we crossed the bridge with Christo walking, between the two galleries. And I asked what I always ask artists, what is your unrealized project? And he said, I've got basically 2 projects I always wanted to do. He said, I want a floating mastaba and I want a mastaba in the desert. And of course, I found the interview here where Christo told me that actually in 1977, he made the first drawing for the mastaba for Abu Dhabi and then visited the nation in 1979, organized by the French Foreign Office. And it was actually you who translated for him on this very first trip. So I wanted to ask you to tell us about this encounter.
Hans, how exciting. And you have always been a path breaker. I mean, you talked about Ital Adnan when you first discovered her. She was selling her works of art for $10,000. My God, you can't get her works of art now, even if you pay a fortune. Christo, I think, is a genius. We all love him. We love his work. Jean-Claude, I remember them, of course, when they came in the 70s, and they had this, then it seemed a crazy idea. He said, I want to go out in the desert, and I want to make a pyramid of barrels, and then I want to put it out in the desert, and then, of course, I want to take it down again, because he was like a Zen monk. He likes to do things and then to take them and walk away with them. But in effect, we discussed them. Sadly, of course, Jean-Claude passed away, and with Christo, I know it remained as his dream. And today, the first thing I did, I came in from Paris. I went on a pilgrimage to see the mastaba in the Serpentine, and I read, of course, the notes and the story about it there. I believe that he has an amazing idea. I believe it's an important one. He wishes for that work of art. I think as we pass a certain age, we have passed it, you have not yet approached it, people start thinking perhaps about leaving a legacy. I believe if it works, it will be a lasting legacy. He wants it to be a permanent work of art. I know that there are discussions going between senior officials in the government and between Christo, and I know that there are negotiations and these talks need to be developed, but like their visit in the 70s was an amazing visit. That idea came out, and we believe it's a great idea. I sincerely hope that the talks will be able to reach at something that is agreeable, that is to both sides, and that we can move ahead of it. Of course, Christo has been very active in the UAE since then, since that visit in the 70s. He sponsors with ADMAF, or with the New York University in Abu Dhabi, an art prize. They have been able to identify a number of leading artists in the UAE. And let me say here, when we talk about artists in the UAE, we do not mean only UAE national artists, although we are very proud of them. And I believe that today we have some of them who are truly becoming internationally recognized. I know that the Guggenheim in New York, for instance, will have an exhibition, a retrospective exhibition of Hassan Sharif in 2 years' time. I know that Abdel Qadir Reyes will be exhibited in the Institut du Monde Arabe in September. So these are important artists we have, and we are proud of them. But when we talk about UAE artists, we talk about all artists who work in the UAE and produce wonderful art. The UAE, as you know, is a community of 200 different nationalities that coexist together, live together. We have mosques, we have churches, we have Hindu temples, we have artists who actually made their mark in the UAE, including, as you know, Iranian artists like Mushiri, like the Zada, the brothers. We have art fairs that bring out, the UAE is at a hub, it's in the center of a wide strategic, geographic strategic area that brings through talent, that brings through art, that has now become recognized worldwide. I know, and as you know, the Tate in London, the Pompidou, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the Guggenheim, the MoMA in New York, they're all beginning to recognize that art is not only Western-centric, that there is great art in other parts of the world, including Egypt, Iraq, and Syria, the Gulf, Iran, India, Pakistan, and of course you have always been a major path breaker in this, and we appreciate, Hans, what you do, and we are happy always to have you come to us and discover new artists. But tell us about them in advance so that we can also add to our collection.
And I'm very touched that you mentioned Hassan Sharif, because I had extraordinary encounters with him on several occasions in his house, which is like a Gesamtkunstwerk. It's a bit like Schwitters Märzbar, and he, of course, was at the origin of the UAE Dada. You know, and I'm from Zurich, where there was another Dada, so we have a Dada connection with him. But it's not only Hassan Sharif, the late Hassan Sharif I want to remember here, but I want to I thought we should dedicate tonight's conversation to our friend Zaha Hadid, because that is how you and I met.
That's right.
Because Zaha, in her incredible generosity, she would always want her friends to meet. And it was a very important thing for her that her friends would meet. And she brought us together in Berlin, maybe 7-8 years ago. And Zaha, of course, was very close to the Serpentine. She was a trustee for more than 20 years. She basically built the first pavilion in 2000. She's the only architect to build 2 pavilions, because she built the second one in 2007. She then also, of course, built our permanent building, the only building of hers in central London, our gallery where we did the first lecture of Christo, which actually, produced the mastaba. And Zaha always told me, about the UAE. She told me about the encounters with you. I found today an interview with her where she talked about this connection between digital work and the 21st century digital technology and the patterning in Islamic art and architecture. And she said geometry guides it all. We always think that Islamic architecture is only about arches or decorative elements, but there is actually a connection between that world and a very progressive digital work, which I think is very interesting. And so I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about your friendship with Zaha, your memories of Zaha.
Well, first of all, thank you, Hans, for dedicating this evening to Zaha Hadid. I think she was a great artist, she was a great architect, she was a polymath, actually, not only architect, but herself an artist. She did design, as you know, she did different things. She built a bridge for us, the Zayed Bridge in Abu Dhabi. She designed for us a performing arts theater that was to be built on Saadiyat Island. I remember the design. They're always futuristic, but they're always amazing, and they always work. People initially were hostile to her designs because they always said that they are difficult, that they are not, they are just concepts, but they cannot be realized. But in effect, all of her designs were realized, or most of them were realized, and they were great, as you said, they were great architectural, iconic buildings. We remember her fondly. I mean, we sat with her, we met with her many, many times. We discussed the projects with her. I remember that meeting in Berlin. That was the time we were discussing the whole concept of the Saadiyat project with our friend Tom Krenz also, who was at the time the president of the Guggenheim in New York. And I am happy that towards the end of her life at last, she was recognized internationally. I mean, she was neglected for a long time, certainly in her own region that she came from the Middle East, where she originated from, even in England and in Europe and in the West. But towards the end of her life, she was recognized. And again, thanks to your help, to your assistance, your ability to bring her out, to have your interviews with her, to show what she is capable of doing, and then to bring confidence to her as well. I believe that her friendship with you was also very important to her. So I'm grateful that you bring her name to us this evening, and I certainly hope that she rests in peace where she is right now.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to ask you a last question, because I think we are soon running out of time, but I wanted to talk about the current initiatives, because you're of course involved with so many projects now in the Office for Public and Cultural Diplomacy, and we spoke about it earlier tonight also with Shumon. It's of course a newly launched initiative of which you are minister, working with the diplomatic missions really around the world. It's a completely global project on all continents, so it's very much connected to this idea, you know, of when Edouard Glissant talks about culture as an archipelago of many, many islands. And of course it involves also conversations with Noura Al-Kabi, Minister of Culture and Knowledge Development, who is here tonight. So I wanted to tell us a little bit about these many projects as a last question.
Well then, as the first 50 years, I look at the first 50 years as the years of foundation, the years where the infrastructures were put in place by our leadership. By the time that Sheikh Zayed passed away in 2004, there was a new, if you like, strategy for developing this further onto global horizons. And that was where great strategies were put into place in order to bring culture even more into our lives, into the lives of our young generation. And there's a number of reasons for that. Of course, economics, and of course, educational, but also political, because the Middle East, we see the Middle East disintegrating around us. We see so many states develop into fragile states and then become failed states. And then we see the violence, and that violence that also impacts Europe and we are no longer separated from each other by long distances. The huge waves of immigration that came to Europe that nearly broke down the European Union. We see populism also spread across the Western Hemisphere, elsewhere in the world, of course. And our leadership believes that we should bring culture again into the heart of our diplomatic relationship with the rest of the world. This is my role within the Foreign Ministry, is to work with our cultural stakeholders in the Emirates, Noura Al-Kabi, our minister, Dubai Art, Global Art, Abu Dhabi Art, the Sharjah Foundation, the Fujairah Foundation for Culture, the Al-Guwain, Ajman, all of whatever is happening. And then we need to bring this, to facilitate for our missions abroad, the ability to bring this into their mission, into their working with people to people, rather than have our missions merely address the political decision makers, the government officials, address themselves people to people. And again, to establish those close ties that make us see what brings us together as a family. How can we share each other's values? How can we appreciate the differences? Because there will be differences, but at the same time respect those differences. We don't need to be overwhelmed by the political ideologies that are submerging us and making us forget what is really important. In the end, what is important for every country, for every community, for every individual, is to feel himself, herself, as an individual in touch with the rest of the world around him. This is our mission. It's to facilitate this narrative, to bring it to our missions abroad, and to help our missions in transmitting these values to all those around them. As I said, to peoples, because in the end, it's peoples that make the difference. Governments sometimes go on divergent paths, but people can always come together by sharing their values and by respecting each other's differences.
Zaki, thank you so very, very much.
Thank you very much.